This conversation is uncomfortable for many people, and that is exactly why it matters. For years, we were told that dating struggles were individual failures, that if things were not working, it was because someone was not trying hard enough or was not good enough. But what happens when millions of men reach the same conclusion at the same time, quietly and without protest, and simply step away? What happens when the silence grows so large that it becomes impossible to ignore? Stay with me to the end of this video, because what we are going to talk about is not about anger. It is about patterns, consequences, and a shift that cannot be reversed. Before we get into it, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all so you get every single angry guy video the moment we release it. If you want more clear, honest conversations like this without filters or corporate scripts, this is where you get them. I also want you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of this video. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets, how to buy, sell, and trade crypto, and how to grow your wealth in a world that is becoming more unstable by the year, the Academy is there for you. Go check it out now and take control of your financial future instead of leaving it in someone else's hands. And if you're enjoying these angry guy videos and want to show support for the work that goes into making them, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It helps more than you think. And I appreciate every single one of you who chooses to support the channel that way. Now, let us talk about what is really happening. There is a growing reality that is difficult to deny once you stop listening to slogans and start paying attention to behavior. A large number of men have concluded that modern dating is no longer worth the cost, the stress, or the risk. This conclusion did not come from one event or one trend. It came from decades of accumulated experiences, stories shared quietly between friends, outcomes observed repeatedly, and lessons learned the hard way. When people hear statements like most men no longer believe dating is worth it, they often assume bitterness or exaggeration. What they miss is that this shift did not begin with anger. It began with confusion, then disappointment, then fatigue, and finally resignation. For a long time, men were told that they needed to change in order to be acceptable. They were told their instincts were wrong, their boundaries were outdated, and their expectations were unreasonable. They were told that masculinity itself was a problem that needed correction. At the same time, they were told they were still expected to provide, to protect, to initiate, to pay, and to absorb risk. The message became contradictory. Be softer, but still be strong. Be sensitive, but do not hesitate. Step up, but stay in your lane. Over time, many men realized that no matter what they did, the rules could change without notice, and they would still be blamed for the outcome. And this is where the quiet shift began. Men started paying attention to results instead of promises. They noticed that good intentions did not protect them from bad outcomes. They noticed that effort did not guarantee appreciation, stability, or loyalty. They noticed that accountability was often one sided. In family courts, in social conflicts, and in public narratives, men increasingly felt that the benefit of the doubt no longer existed for them. Even when acting in good faith, they could find themselves assumed guilty, careless, or disposable. This creates caution. Caution turns into distance. Distance eventually turns into withdrawal. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the shift is that walking away is not the same as giving up. Many men who step away from dating are not isolated or depressed. In fact, many report the opposite. They experience relief. They experience clarity. They discover that being alone is not the same as feeling lonely. When you remove constant tension, constant evaluation, and constant uncertainty from your life, something interesting happens. You begin to hear your own thoughts again. You begin to notice what you actually enjoy. You begin to invest time and energy into things that give something back instead of draining you. For decades, men were told that relationships were the primary measure of success and fulfillment. Without one, something must be wrong. But when men step back and look honestly at their experiences, many realize that the relationships they were chasing did not provide peace, stability, or mutual respect. They provided obligation, anxiety, and imbalance. Once that realization settles in, it becomes very difficult to unsee it. You cannot convince someone to return to a game once they believe the rules are stacked against them. Another factor driving this shift is public behavior and public shaming. Social media changed the dynamics of everyday interactions. Ordinary moments can now be recorded, edited, and broadcast without context. Many men have learned that even neutral behavior can be interpreted in the worst possible light, and the cost of being misunderstood can be severe. Reputation, career, and social standing can be damaged in minutes, often without any meaningful opportunity to respond. When the risk of simply existing in public spaces feels disproportionate, people adapt by minimizing exposure. They avoid unnecessary interactions. They keep to themselves. They disengage. This is not about fear, it is about risk management. Men are increasingly applying the same logic to dating that they apply to finances or business decisions. They ask, what is the potential upside and what is the potential downside? When the downside includes legal complications, public accusations, financial loss, and long term stress, and the upside feels uncertain or temporary, many conclude that the rational choice is to opt out. This is not emotional, it is analytical. There is also a generational component to this. Younger men grew up watching the experiences of older men. They watched divorces, custody battles, financial ruin, and emotional burnout. They listened to advice that often came too late. Instead of learning through personal failure, many learned through observation. They adjusted their expectations early. They delayed commitment or rejected it altogether. When people say men are no longer interested in traditional paths, what they often mean is that men are no longer willing to ignore evidence. What makes this moment different from past cultural shifts is that men are not organizing protests or demanding changes. They are not asking to be understood. They are simply redirecting their energy. They focus on health, hobbies, work, friendships, and personal peace. They simplify their lives. Many discover that they need far less than they were told to be content: a quiet home, financial stability, control over their time, and freedom from constant conflict becomes more valuable than social approval. Minimalism plays a role here. Men tend to remove what does not serve them once they recognize it as a liability. This applies to possessions, commitments, and relationships. When you strip life down to what actually matters to you, clarity follows. That clarity makes it harder to justify returning to situations that previously caused stress or dissatisfaction. Once peace becomes the baseline, chaos becomes unacceptable. There is also a broader economic and social context that cannot be ignored. As living costs rise and stability becomes harder to achieve, men are prioritizing self preservation. They are cautious about taking on responsibilities that could jeopardize their ability to remain solvent and independent. In uncertain times, risk tolerance decreases. Dating, marriage, and long term commitments are no longer viewed as safe investments. They are viewed as variables with too many unknowns. At the same time, there is a visible frustration from those who expected men to continue participating as they always had. When patterns change, people notice. There is confusion, anger, and disbelief. Some interpret withdrawal as punishment or spite. In reality, it is indifference. Men who walk away are not trying to teach a lesson, they are trying to protect their own well being. When someone reaches that stage, persuasion rarely works. You cannot shame someone into sacrificing their peace. Another important point is that men are increasingly trusting what they can observe rather than what they are told. Patterns matter, outcomes matter. When words and actions do not align, people believe the actions. This is not cynicism, it is pattern recognition. When the same behaviors produce the same results over and over, it becomes unreasonable to expect a different outcome by repeating the same approach. This shift also challenges long held narratives about fulfillment. For years, fulfillment was marketed as something that comes from external validation, relationships, and constant pursuit. But many men are discovering fulfillment in stability, routine, and self mastery. They enjoy building something for themselves without external interference. They enjoy rest without guilt. They enjoy solitude without apology. This does not make them broken, it makes them deliberate. The phrase men walking away. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Is not about isolation, it is about choice. It is about refusing to participate in systems that no longer feel fair or beneficial. It is about opting out of dynamics that demand sacrifice without reciprocity. When enough individuals make the same choice independently, it signals a structural issue rather than a personal flaw. As society adjusts to this reality, there will be attempts to explain it away. Some will say men are afraid. Others will say men are immature or unwilling to adapt. These explanations miss the point. Men adapted, they adapted by leaving. Adaptation does not always look like compliance, and sometimes it looks like refusal. What we are witnessing is not a temporary trend. It is a long-term realignment of priorities. When someone builds a life that feels stable and peaceful, it becomes very difficult to convince them to reintroduce chaos. Promises are not enough. Apologies are not enough. Trust, once broken repeatedly, is not easily restored. This does not mean relationships are impossible or inherently negative. It means they are no longer assumed to be necessary or desirable by default. They must now compete with the value of peace, autonomy, and predictability. That is a very high bar. As more men reach this conclusion, the dating landscape changes, expectations shift, the pool of participants shrinks. Those who remain often have stricter boundaries and clearer standards. They are less willing to compromise their core values. They are less influenced by social pressure. They are comfortable saying no. This is why many conversations around this topic feel tense. They confront assumptions that have gone unchallenged for a long time. They force a reckoning with cause and effect. Actions have consequences, even when those consequences take years to materialize. When enough people decide that a system no longer works for them, the system changes or collapses. Men walking away are not asking for permission. They are not waiting for approval. They have already moved on. They are building lives that make sense to them, even if those lives do not fit traditional narratives. They are choosing peace over validation, stability over drama, and reality over ideology. This is not the end of relationships or connection. It is the end of unquestioned participation. It is the end of automatic sacrifice. It is the end of ignoring red flags for the sake of appearances. What comes next will be shaped by whether accountability and balance can return to the conversation. What makes this shift so powerful is that it did not require coordination or leadership. There was no manifesto, no central figure telling men what to do. It emerged organically, the way patterns always do when enough people experience the same outcomes. Men compared notes quietly. They listened more than they spoke. They watched how situations played out for others before deciding what risks they were willing to take themselves. Over time, a shared understanding formed, not as an ideology, but as a practical conclusion. If something consistently costs more than it gives back, the rational response is to step away. That conclusion does not require anger to sustain it. It requires only memory. One of the hardest things for many people to accept is that this withdrawal is not loud. It is not dramatic. There are no farewell speeches. Men simply stop showing up. They stop initiating. They stop chasing. They stop explaining themselves. Silence replaces debate. Absence replaces argument. That is why the shift feels sudden to those who were not paying attention. When participation drops below a certain threshold, the effects become visible all at once. Dating apps feel emptier, social spaces feel quieter, expectations go unmet, confusion sets in, followed by frustration. But by the time these signs appear, the decision has already been made by many. Another layer to this is the psychological toll of constant contradiction. Men were told to be open and expressive, but punished when that openness was used against them later. They were told to communicate, but learned that communication could be reframed or weaponized. Over time, many learned that silence was safer than explanation, not because they had nothing to say, but because saying it no longer led to understanding. When communication stops producing positive results, people conserve their energy and stop offering it freely. There is also a growing awareness of asymmetry and accountability. When things go wrong, responsibility is often assigned unevenly. Men are expected to anticipate, adapt, and absorb. When they fail to do so perfectly, the failure is treated as proof of moral deficiency rather than human limitation. Living under constant scrutiny erodes trust. Trust cannot exist when one side feels permanently on trial. The natural response is withdrawal. Financial considerations play an equally important role. Modern life is expensive, unpredictable, and unforgiving. Men are increasingly cautious about entanglements that could compromise their financial stability. They have seen how quickly years of effort can be undone. They have learned that recovery is not always guaranteed. When survival and security are at stake, idealism gives way to realism. Dreams are recalculated. Risks are reassessed. Many decide that protecting what they have built is more important than pursuing what might be taken away. This realism extends beyond money. It applies to emotional labor as well. Many men realized they were expected to be endlessly supportive without receiving the same level of consideration in return. They were expected to be strong without being seen, reliable without being appreciated, present without being prioritized. Over time, that imbalance becomes impossible to justify. Walking away becomes an act of self respect rather than rejection. There is an assumption in some circles that men will eventually return if conditions worsen or pressure increases. That assumption misunderstands the nature of the change. Once someone experiences peace after years of tension, the contrast is stark. It rewires priorities, it reshapes identity. Peace becomes non negotiable. Returning to chaos would require a compelling reason, not guilt or fear. So far, many men do not see one. Another misconception is that men who walk away are incapable of connection. In reality, many maintain strong friendships, family ties, and communities. They are not disconnected from people. They are disconnected from systems that felt exploitative or unstable. They invest where reciprocity exists. They withdraw where it does not. This selectivity is not cruelty, it is discernment. Technology has amplified this discernment. Access to information allows people to compare experiences across regions and cultures. Patterns that were once hidden become obvious. When stories align across thousands of individuals who have never met, it becomes harder to dismiss them as coincidence. Men see that their experiences are not isolated. Validation does not come from approval, but from recognition. Recognition reduces self doubt. Reduced self doubt strengthens resolve. This also explains why attempts to shame men back into participation often fail. Shame works only when the target values the approval of the source. When men stop seeking validation from systems that no longer serve them, shame loses its power. Indifference replaces compliance. That indifference is deeply unsettling to those who relied on expectation and obligation to maintain balance. What we are witnessing is a renegotiation of value. Men are asking what they are expected to give and what they receive in return. When the exchange feels unfair, they opt out. This is not unique to relationships. It mirrors behavior in workplaces, institutions, and markets. People leave environments that demand loyalty without offering respect. They leave jobs that promise growth but deliver burnout. They leave arrangements that benefit one side disproportionately. Dating is no longer immune to this logic. The long term implications are significant. When fewer men participate, dynamics shift. Scarcity changes leverage. Expectations that once went unquestioned begin to face resistance. Standards evolve. Some adapt, others double down. The outcome depends on whether balance can be restored. Balance cannot be demanded, it must be demonstrated consistently over time. Another aspect often overlooked is how this shift affects identity. For generations, men were defined by what they provided to others. When they step away from that role, they are forced to redefine themselves on their own terms. This can be disorienting at first, but it can also be liberating. Men discover interests and capacities that were previously neglected. They pursue skills, knowledge, and goals that are internally motivated rather than socially imposed. This self directed growth is quieter than traditional milestones, but it is no less meaningful. Men build routines that support their health, they manage their finances with intention, they cultivate hobbies that bring satisfaction rather than status. Over time, their lives become less reactive and more deliberate. This is not stagnation, it is recalibration. And critics often interpret this as avoidance of responsibility. That interpretation assumes that responsibility is defined only by service to others, but responsibility to oneself is equally valid. Preserving mental health, financial stability, and personal integrity are responsibilities that cannot be outsourced. Ignoring them leads to collapse. Men who walk away are not rejecting responsibility. They are choosing which responsibilities they will accept. There is also a cultural lag at play. Narratives change slower than behavior. While many men have already adjusted their lives, public conversations still operate on outdated assumptions. Advice, expectations, and criticism are often based on a version of society that no longer exists. This creates friction. Men are told to conform to standards that no longer align with reality. Rather than argue, many simply disengage. It is important to understand that this is not about hostility. Most men who walk away do not wish harm or failure on anyone. They wish to be left alone. They want the freedom to live without constant negotiation. They want predictability. They want fairness. When those conditions are absent, withdrawal becomes the path of least resistance. This brings us to an uncomfortable truth. Systems that rely on participation cannot survive indifference. Anger can be challenged. Protest can be suppressed. Indifference erodes foundations silently. When men stop investing time, energy, and resources, consequences follow. Those consequences are not punishment, they are arithmetic. As more men focus inward, society will have to adjust. Expectations will have to be re examined. Assumptions will have to be questioned. This adjustment may be slow and uneven. There may be denial. There may be backlash. But the underlying pattern will persist as long as the incentives remain misaligned. Some will ask what would bring men back. That question itself reveals a misunderstanding. The goal is not to bring anyone back. The goal is to create conditions where participation is genuinely mutually beneficial. Participation should be a choice, not an obligation enforced by shame or fear. When benefits outweigh risks, people participate willingly. When they do not, they leave. This moment represents a turning point. It challenges deeply ingrained beliefs about roles, value, and entitlement. It forces a reconsideration of what fairness looks like in modern life. These conversations are difficult because they expose contradictions that have been ignored for too long. But avoiding them does not make the consequences disappear. As we continue to explore this topic, it is essential to stay grounded in observable reality, not anecdotes designed to provoke outrage, but consistent patterns across time and place. What people do matters more than what they say. What they choose consistently reveals what they value. Men walking away are not lost. They are not broken. They are not confused. They have made a calculation based on experience. They have chosen peace over participation in systems they no longer trust. Whether that trust can be rebuilt remains to be seen. This is not a temporary pause. It is a structural shift driven by incentives, outcomes, and lived experience. Understanding it requires honesty rather than judgment. It requires listening rather than lecturing. It requires accountability rather than deflection. And as this shift deepens, something else becomes apparent that many did not expect. Men are not just withdrawing from dating, they are withdrawing from narratives that no longer align with their lived experience. For a long time, stories were told about how society works, about what men should want, about what fulfillment looks like, and about what sacrifices are noble and necessary. Those stories were repeated so often that they became background noise, rarely questioned. But when reality consistently contradicts a story, people eventually stop believing the story. What replaces it is not cynicism, but pragmatism. Pragmatism changes how men interpret their own lives. Instead of asking whether they are measuring up to an external standard, they ask whether their lives feel stable, calm, and meaningful to them personally. This internal measurement system is far more difficult to manipulate. It cannot be easily influenced by trends or social pressure. Once a man begins evaluating his life this way, many of the old incentives lose their power. Approval matters less, labels matter less. What matters is whether tomorrow feels manageable and whether today feels worthwhile. One of the most striking outcomes of this change is how little drama accompanies it. There is no collective outrage fueling it, no sustained emotional campaign. Men are not marching, shouting, or demanding reform. They are quietly building parallel lives that require less explanation. They invest in skills rather than appearances. They invest in savings rather than symbols. They invest in health rather than constant social validation. These investments compound over time, reinforcing the decision to step away rather than undermining it. Another factor worth addressing is how expectations evolved without renegotiation. For decades, expectations placed on men increased while the assurances offered in return became less concrete. Men were told to be adaptable, but the structures around them became increasingly rigid. They were told to communicate, but conversations often felt one directional. They were told to commit, but commitments were treated as provisional. Over time, this imbalance created a sense that effort was being requested without security being offered. Security is an important word here, not in the material sense alone, but in the emotional and legal sense as well. People commit more easily when they feel protected by fairness and consistency. When rules feel subjective or outcomes feel unpredictable, commitment becomes a gamble rather than a partnership. Men who walk away are not rejecting connection, they are rejecting uncertainty that carries disproportionate cost. This is why many men describe their withdrawal not as loss, but as relief. Relief from constant second guessing, relief from walking on unseen lines, relief from pressure to perform roles that no longer feel reciprocal. That relief is powerful. It creates a reference point. Once someone experiences that level of calm, it becomes the standard against which all future choices are measured. There's also a growing awareness that not all progress moves in the same direction for everyone. Changes that benefit one group may impose new burdens on another. A healthy society requires ongoing adjustment and dialogue. But when dialogue is replaced by accusation and adjustment is demanded rather than negotiated, trust erodes. Trust cannot be commanded, it must be earned and maintained. When trust collapses, withdrawal is not rebellion, it is self defense. Another layer to this discussion involves time. Time is the one resource that cannot be replenished. Men are increasingly conscious of how they spend it. They ask whether the return justifies the investment. Long periods of effort with unclear or negative outcomes lead people to reallocate their time elsewhere. This is not unique to dating, but dating is where the contrast has become most visible. As men invest their time differently, they discover new forms of fulfillment that do not rely on external approval. Learning, building, improving, and mastering something tangible offers satisfaction that is stable and repeatable. These pursuits do not suddenly change the rules or reinterpret intentions. They reward consistency, they reward patience, they reward discipline. In a world that feels increasingly unstable, this predictability is deeply appealing. This also explains why attempts to frame men as victims or villains fail to resonate. Men walking away do not see themselves as either. They see themselves as adults making informed choices. They are not seeking sympathy, and they are not interested in conflict. They simply do not wish to participate in arrangements that feel imbalanced. That neutrality is often mistaken for hostility because it does not offer the emotional engagement some expect. When engagement disappears, accountability becomes unavoidable. Systems that once relied on assumption must now justify themselves. Expectations that were once automatic must now be negotiated. This can be uncomfortable, especially for those who benefited from the old defaults. But discomfort does not invalidate the underlying change. It signals that adjustment is required. Another important point is that the shift is not evenly distributed. Some men remain interested in dating and relationships, but they approach them with stricter boundaries and clearer expectations. They are more selective. They are less willing to tolerate behavior that contradicts their values. They are less likely to ignore warning signs. This selectivity further reinforces the broader trend because it raises the standard for participation across the board. The idea that men will simply return if conditions worsen misunderstands human behavior. People rarely return to situations that previously caused harm unless there is compelling evidence of change. Promises are not evidence. Messaging is not evidence. Only sustained, observable behavior over time can rebuild trust. Until then, skepticism remains rational. There is also a generational memory forming. Younger men are growing up in a world where walking away is normalized rather than stigmatized. They do not view it as failure, they view it as an option. When an option exists, people use it. This normalizes independence and reduces pressure to conform to paths that no longer feel secure. As this continues, conversations about responsibility and contribution will need to evolve. Responsibility cannot mean endless sacrifice without safeguards. Contribution cannot mean if with obligation without appreciation. If society wants participation, it must offer fairness. Fairness is not a slogan, it is a structure. It must be reflected in outcomes, not just intentions. This brings us to the broader implications for culture. When large numbers of men disengage, certain assumptions about labor, consumption, and support are challenged. Men who are no longer trying to impress or compete spend differently. They prioritize utility over display. They save more. They consume less frivolously. This has ripple effects across markets and industries that once relied on aspirational spending and socially. There is also a shift toward smaller, more intentional circles. Men invest in friendships that are reciprocal and low maintenance. They value reliability over excitement. These relationships are often quieter but more durable. They provide support without drama. This further reduces the perceived need for romantic involvement as a primary source of connection. Critics may argue that this leads to isolation, but isolation is defined by lack of connection, not lack of romantic partnership. Many men report feeling more connected to themselves and to a few trusted people than they ever did in crowded social environments. Quality replaces quantity, depth replaces performance. Another aspect often ignored is how men reinterpret success. Success becomes less about status and more about control. Control over time, control over finances, control over environment. This redefinition makes many traditional incentives ineffective. You cannot motivate someone with promises they no longer value. As this redefinition spreads, it creates a cultural mismatch. Institutions and narratives built around older definitions struggle to adapt. Advice that once felt relevant now feels disconnected. Men are told to strive for goals that no longer align with their priorities. Instead of arguing, they disengage. Silence replaces debate once again. This silence should not be mistaken for apathy. It is a signal that engagement is no longer productive. When people believe their participation will not change outcomes, they conserve their energy. They invest it where they see tangible results. This is rational behavior. The question many are asking, sometimes out loud and sometimes quietly, is whether balance can be restored. Balance requires symmetry in risk and reward. It requires accountability on all sides. It requires acknowledgement of past outcomes, not dismissal of them. Without that, any attempt to re engage will feel superficial. Men walking away are not waiting to be convinced. They are watching. They are observing whether actions change. They are paying attention to patterns. Until those patterns shift meaningfully, their decision remains reinforced by daily experience. This is why conversations around this topic often stall. They focus on emotions rather than incentives. They emphasize messaging rather than structure. They seek to persuade rather than reform. But persuasion without reform cannot succeed. People respond to conditions, not slogans. As we move deeper into this era, it becomes clear that the old assumptions no longer hold. Participation is optional. Commitment is conditional. Respect must be mutual. These are not radical ideas. They are foundational principles that were ignored for too long. And men who have stepped away are not seeking validation for their choice. They do not need permission. Their lives already reflect the outcome of that choice. Stability reinforces conviction. Peace strengthens resolve. Understanding the shift requires setting aside moral judgments and focusing on incentives. What encourages participation? What discourages it? When those questions are answered honestly, the trend becomes predictable rather than mysterious. As this realignment continues, another pattern emerges that is easy to miss if you are only looking for loud signals. Men are not replacing one dependency with another. They are not trading romantic involvement for endless distraction or reckless behavior. In many cases, they are becoming more disciplined, not less. Structure replaces chaos. Routine replaces unpredictability. This shift toward order is not accidental. It is a response to environments that felt unstable. When people feel exposed to risk they cannot control, they seek domains where effort reliably produces results. And this is why many men gravitate towards systems that reward consistency. Physical training, skill development, financial planning, and long term projects all provide feedback loops that feel fair. You put in work, you see progress. There is no sudden reversal based on interpretation or mood. There is no retroactive rule change. The clarity of cause and effect is calming. Over time, this clarity becomes addictive in the healthiest sense of the word. It reinforces self trust. Self trust is one of the most important outcomes of this shift. Many men spent years doubting their instincts because they were told those instincts were flawed or harmful. When they step away and begin making decisions solely based on outcomes, that doubt fades. They learn that their judgment was not broken, it was simply overridden by external pressure. Regaining confidence in one's own perception changes everything. It alters how future decisions are made and how risk is assessed. This regained self trust also explains why many men are resistant to narratives that frame them as lost or confused. They do not feel lost. They feel grounded. They know what their days look like. They know what their goals are. They know what they are willing to tolerate and what they are not. This clarity is deeply stabilizing. It reduces anxiety, it reduces rumination, it frees mental space. Another consequence of this clarity is emotional regulation. When men are no longer navigating constant tension or ambiguity, their emotional baseline stabilizes. They are less reactive because there is less provocation. They are less defensive because they are not under constant evaluation. This calm is often mistaken for detachment, but it is better understood as equilibrium. Emotional energy is preserved rather than depleted. This preservation of energy leads to another important outcome. Men become more selective, not only in relationships, but in conversations, commitments, and causes. They ask whether engagement will lead to understanding or simply drain resources. If the answer is unclear or negative, they opt out. This selectivity is not apathy, it is prioritization. In a world where attention is constantly demanded, withholding it becomes a form of self protection. As more men adopt this approach, the social environment changes. There is less tolerance for performative conflict, less appetite for endless debate that leads nowhere, less interest in ideological purity tests. Practical concerns rise to the surface. What works? What does not? What can be improved? What should be avoided? This pragmatism reshapes interactions across the board. There is also a noticeable shift in how men approach personal responsibility. Rather than defining responsibility as sacrifice for abstract ideals, they define it as stewardship of their own lives. They ask whether their choices are sustainable, whether their routines support long term health, whether their finances can withstand shocks. This forward looking responsibility contrasts sharply with narratives that frame responsibility solely as service to others. Both can coexist, but only when boundaries are respected. One of the reasons this shift generates resistance is that it removes leverage. When men stop seeking approval and validation, many traditional incentives lose effectiveness. Guilt no longer motivates, fear no longer compels, praise no longer controls. This does not mean men are immune to influence. It means influence must now be earned through reciprocity and respect rather than assumed entitlement. Another subtle change is how men view compromise. Compromise used to be framed as a moral virtue regardless of context. Now it is evaluated based on symmetry. Is compromise mutual or one sided? Does it preserve dignity on both sides? Does it lead to a stable outcome? If the answer is no, compromise is rejected. This does not make men inflexible, it makes them discerning. Discerning people are harder to manipulate. They ask follow up questions, they look for patterns, they wait before committing. This patience frustrates systems built on urgency and pressure. When men no longer rush to meet expectations, those expectations must justify themselves. That justification has often been lacking, and as this patience becomes widespread, timelines change. Men are less concerned with meeting age based milestones. They are less influenced by comparisons. They operate on internal clocks rather than external schedules. This reduces stress and increases satisfaction. Life becomes something to be shaped rather than raced through. There is also an economic dimension to this patience. Men who are not rushing to impress or provide beyond their means make different financial choices. They avoid unnecessary debt. They prioritize liquidity. They plan for uncertainty. This financial conservatism is not fear driven, it is outcome driven. It reflects lessons learned from observing volatility. Over time, these choices compound. Financial stability reinforces independence. Independence reinforces selectivity. Selectivity reinforces peace. This feedback loop makes reversal unlikely. Once someone experiences the benefits of this alignment, returning to previous patterns feels irrational. This is why messaging that frames men as missing out often falls flat. Missing out on what? On instability, on conflict, on uncertainty. When the alternative feels better, the argument collapses. Desire cannot be manufactured where satisfaction already exists. Another important observation is that men who walk away do not necessarily oppose relationships. They oppose assumptions. They oppose obligations that are not reciprocal. They oppose risk structures that expose them disproportionately. If those structures change, behavior may change, but change must be real, not rhetorical. The difficulty lies in acknowledging past outcomes honestly. Many conversations stall because acknowledging outcomes feels like assigning blame. But accountability is not about blame, it is about learning. Without learning, repetition is inevitable. Men learned, they adjusted, others may need to do the same. This adjustment will not be immediate. Cultural narratives lag behind lived reality. There will be attempts to reframe the issue as a temporary mood or generational quirk. There will be efforts to dismiss it as avoidance or immaturity. These explanations avoid engaging with incentives. As long as incentives remain misaligned, behavior will persist regardless of how it is labeled. Another consequence of this shift is reduced tolerance for double standards. Men who have stepped away are less willing to accept rules that apply unevenly. They question policies, norms, and expectations more openly. When explanations rely on moral pressure rather than logic, skepticism increases. This skepticism is not rebellion, it is evaluation. Evaluation changes dynamics everywhere it appears. It forces clarity. It exposes contradictions. It reveals where values and outcomes diverge. For some systems, this exposure is uncomfortable, but discomfort is often the precursor to reform. As this evaluation continues, men become more confident saying no without justification, no explanations, no debates, no apologies. This boundary setting is one of the most visible signs of the shift. When no becomes a complete sentence, power dynamics change. Power dynamics always adjust when participation becomes optional. This is not unique to dating. It appears in labor markets, consumer behavior, and social movements. When individuals recognize their leverage, they use it quietly. They exit rather than protest. Exit is often more effective than voice, and this exit does not require consensus. Each individual acts based on personal calculus. The aggregate effect emerges naturally. That is why the shift feels both gradual and sudden. Gradual in individual decisions, sudden in collective impact. Another area where this shift is evident is in how men approach communication. They are more direct. They avoid ambiguity. They state boundaries early. This reduces misunderstandings and filters out incompatible situations quickly. Efficiency replaces prolonged uncertainty. This efficiency is often misinterpreted as coldness. In reality, it reflects respect for time and energy. Clear expectations prevent future conflict. Men who value peace prioritize clarity. They do not enjoy extended negotiation over fundamental values. As clarity becomes the norm, superficial interactions lose appeal. Men seek depth where it exists and avoid surfaces that demand constant maintenance. This further reduces engagement with environments built on performance rather than substance. The cumulative effect of all these changes is a quieter social landscape, less noise, less spectacle, less reactive behavior. This quiet can feel unsettling to those accustomed to constant engagement, but quiet is not emptiness, it is space. Space allows reflection. Reflection allows adjustment. Adjustment allows growth. Men who have created space in their lives often report increased creativity and focus. They think more clearly, they plan more deliberately, they act with intention rather than impulse. This intentionality is the opposite of disengagement. It is engagement on chosen terms. Men are not withdrawing from life, they are choosing how to participate. That distinction matters. As we look ahead, it becomes clear that the shift will influence future expectations. Younger generations will grow up seeing independence as normal rather than deviant. They will learn that opting out is a valid response to imbalance. This knowledge will shape how they approach relationships, careers, and institutions. Institutions that adapt by offering fairness and reciprocity may regain trust. Those that rely on pressure and assumption will continue to lose participants. This is not ideological, it is behavioral. The challenge for society is not convincing men to return. It is understanding why they left and addressing those causes honestly. Without that understanding, efforts will continue to miss the mark. Men walking away are not an anomaly, they are a signal that something in the structure is misaligned. Signals can be ignored, but the underlying issue remains. As clarity becomes the defining feature of the shift, it also reshapes how men interpret social feedback. In the past, criticism carried weight because it came from sources men believed had legitimacy. Today, legitimacy is evaluated rather than assumed. Men ask whether the source understands their experience, whether the critique aligns with reality, and whether the advice offered has produced positive outcomes for those giving it. When the answer is no, the feedback is discarded without resentment. This filtering process protects focus, it prevents distraction, it preserves momentum. Momentum matters because many men are now building lives that are internally coherent. Their values align with their routines. Their routines align with their goals. When alignment exists, external noise loses its influence. Attempts to provoke reaction fail because reaction would disrupt the equilibrium they have worked to establish. Calm becomes a strategic choice rather than a passive state. This strategic calm is often misunderstood. It is mistaken for apathy or disengagement. In reality, it is the product of careful decision making. Men are choosing where to allocate emotional energy. They are choosing where to invest attention. They are choosing what to ignore. These choices are not arbitrary. They are informed by past outcomes. When engagement repeatedly led to loss, disengagement becomes rational. Another consequence of this calm is improved judgment. Without constant emotional turbulence, men think more clearly. They assess situations with less bias. They recognize patterns sooner. This enhanced judgment further reinforces the decision to walk away from unstable dynamics. The better one's judgment becomes, the harder it is to justify returning to environments that previously clouded it. This improvement in judgment also affects how men evaluate promises of change. They look for evidence rather than assurances. They watch behavior over time rather than responding to statements. This patience frustrates attempts to fast track reconciliation without addressing underlying issues. Men are no longer interested in temporary gestures, they are interested in durable structures. Durable structures require rules that are applied consistently. They require accountability that is shared rather than selective. They require boundaries that are respected rather than tested. When these elements are absent, trust cannot form. Men who have learned this through experience do not gamble on potential. They require proof. There is a subtle but important distinction here. Requiring proof is not cynicism, it is discernment. Cynicism assumes failure, regardless of evidence. Discernment waits for evidence before committing. Men who walk away are often highly discerning. They are open to positive outcomes but unwilling to suspend judgment. This stance protects them from repeating past mistakes. As discernment spreads, it changes the pace of interactions. Things move slower. Commitments are delayed. Assumptions are challenged early. This slower pace filters out incompatibility before it becomes costly. While this can feel inconvenient to those who expect rapid escalation, it ultimately reduces conflict. Slow clarity is preferable to fast confusion. Another effect of this slower pace is reduced emotional volatility. When expectations are managed and assumptions are questioned, disappointment decreases. Men experience fewer emotional spikes because they are not investing prematurely. Emotional stability becomes the norm rather than the exception. This stability is often cited as one of the most valuable outcomes of walking away. Stability also allows for long term planning. Men who are not constantly reacting can think years ahead. They set goals that require sustained effort. They commit to projects that demand patience. This long term orientation contrasts sharply with environments driven by immediate gratification and short term validation. Over time, long term thinking produces tangible results. These results reinforce the belief that stepping away was the correct decision. Success achieved through stability feels earned rather than accidental. It builds confidence. It validates the underlying logic. Each positive outcome strengthens resolve. This resolve is not brittle. It does not rely on constant reinforcement. It is grounded in lived experience. That makes it resilient to criticism and pressure. Men who have built stable lives are not easily swayed by narratives that contradict their reality. As more men reach the stage, conversations about reintegration become increasingly abstract. The question shifts from why men left to what would make participation worthwhile again. That question cannot be answered with slogans. It requires structural change. It requires addressing risk, accountability, and reciprocity in measurable ways. Structural change is difficult because it challenges entrenched assumptions. It requires admitting that some systems produced harm. It requires acknowledging that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. It requires humility. Without humility, reform stalls. One of the barriers to humility is the fear of blame, but accountability does not require blame, it requires recognition. Recognizing that certain patterns produce negative outcomes is not an attack, it is a prerequisite for improvement. Men recognized patterns, they adjusted. Others may need to do the same. Another barrier is the belief that participation can be demanded rather than earned. This belief persists in many areas of life, not just relationships, but demand without incentive leads to resistance or exit. Men chose exit. That choice cannot be reversed by demand alone. The longer this exit persists, the more normalized it becomes. What was once considered unconventional becomes ordinary. What was once stigmatized becomes accepted. Norms shift quietly until they are simply how things are. At that point, reversal becomes unlikely. This normalization has implications for how future generations view commitment. Commitment becomes something entered into cautiously and deliberately rather than assumed. It becomes conditional on fairness rather than tradition. This does not diminish its value, it increases it. When commitment is chosen freely and thoughtfully, it carries greater weight. Another implication is that men will increasingly value environments that offer clear rules and predictable outcomes. This preference may influence where they live, how they work, and who they associate with. Communities that provide stability will attract participation. Those that do not will see attrition. Attrition is not always visible immediately. It begins with reduced engagement, fewer volunteers, fewer initiators, fewer contributors. Over time, the absence becomes noticeable. By then, re engagement requires more than invitation, it requires repair. Repair is more complex than recruitment. It requires addressing the reasons people left. It requires rebuilding trust. It requires demonstrating change consistently over time. This process cannot be rushed. Men who have stepped away are not hostile to repair. They are skeptical. Skepticism is not refusal, it is caution. If repair is genuine and sustained, behavior may change. But skepticism will remain until evidence accumulates. Another dimension worth exploring is how walking away affects mental health. Many men report reduced anxiety, improved sleep, and greater emotional regulation after disengaging from high conflict dynamics. These improvements are not trivial. They affect overall quality of life. When a decision produces such clear benefits, reversing it feels counterproductive. This does not mean men are immune to loneliness or challenges. Life always contains difficulty, but difficulty that arises from chosen pursuits feels different from difficulty imposed by unstable relationships. Chosen difficulty builds resilience. Imposed difficulty breeds resentment. Men prefer the former. This preference influences how men frame hardship. They are more willing to endure challenges that have clear purpose and predictable rules. They are less willing to endure challenges that feel arbitrary or unfair. This distinction guides decision making. As this mindset spreads, it reshapes cultural expectations around sacrifice. Sacrifice without agency loses its moral appeal. Sacrifice chosen freely retains it. Men are redefining what sacrifice means and when it is appropriate. This redefinition may feel threatening to narratives that relied on unquestioned sacrifice, but narratives must adapt to remain relevant. When they do not, people disengage. Disengagement is not rebellion, it is evolution. Evolution is rarely neat. It involves friction, misunderstanding, and resistance, but it also involves learning. Men learn from experience. Their behavior reflects that learning. Ignoring it will not make it disappear. As observers try to make sense of this shift, they often look for singular causes. But the reality is cumulative. Small experiences compound, minor disappointments accumulate, repeated patterns solidify. Eventually, a threshold is crossed. The decision to walk away feels obvious in hindsight. This hindsight clarity is why many men express surprise that they tolerated certain situations for so long. Once removed from them, perspective changes. What once seemed normal now seems unnecessary. This perspective shift is difficult to reverse. The longer men remain outside these dynamics, the more their identity adapts. They no longer see themselves as missing something, they see themselves as having gained something. This gain reframes the entire conversation. Conversations framed around loss fail to resonate with those who feel they have gained peace, clarity, and stability. To, to engage meaningfully, discussions must acknowledge those gains. Without acknowledgement, dialogue remains disconnected. Acknowledgement does not require agreement, it requires recognition of experience. Men want their experiences to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. When dismissal occurs, withdrawal deepens. This is why attempts to pathologize walking away often backfire. Labeling a rational response as dysfunction ignores incentives. It signals unwillingness to engage with substance. Men respond by disengaging further. Engagement cannot be forced. It emerges when conditions feel fair and outcomes feel predictable. Until then, exit remains a valid strategy. As this clarity settles into permanence, it begins to influence not only how men live, but how they interpret meaning itself. Meaning is no longer borrowed from social expectation or inherited narratives. It is constructed from lived experience. Men ask fewer abstract questions about how life should look and more concrete questions about how life actually feels. Does it feel stable? Does it feel honest? Does it feel sustainable? When the answers are yes, justification becomes unnecessary. This shift toward experiential meaning has profound consequences. It reduces susceptibility to ideological pressure. It weakens the power of moral panic. When men evaluate claims against their own daily reality, exaggerated narratives collapse under scrutiny. They trust what they see, what they experience, and what repeats consistently. This grounded perspective acts as a filter against manipulation. Manipulation thrives on uncertainty and fear. When people feel unsure of themselves or their place, they are more easily influenced. Men who have stepped away from destabilizing dynamics often report increased confidence precisely because uncertainty has been reduced. Their lives are simpler, more predictable, and more aligned with their values. That alignment creates psychological resilience. Resilience is not about toughness in the dramatic sense, it is about recovery and adaptability. Men who have reclaimed control over their time and energy recover more quickly from setbacks. They are less shaken by criticism. They adjust rather than collapse. This resilience further validates their decision to disengage from environments that previously eroded it. Another important consequence of this resilience is reduced reactivity to provocation. Many men no longer feel compelled to defend themselves against accusations or stereotypes. They recognize that not every claim deserves a response. Silence becomes a form of discernment rather than surrender. This refusal to engage on hostile terms frustrates attempts to pull them back into conflict. Conflict requires participation. When one side refuses to engage, conflict dissolves. Men walking away are not trying to win arguments. They are opting out of the argument entirely. This choice removes fuel from cycles that once sustained themselves through reaction and counter reaction. As these cycles weaken, attention shifts elsewhere. Men redirect focus toward areas where effort produces tangible results. This redirection has cascading effects. Skills improve, health improves, finances improve. Each improvement reinforces the belief that disengagement was beneficial. This is not theoretical. It is experiential reinforcement. Experiential reinforcement is powerful because it bypasses debate. No argument can outweigh lived improvement. When life feels better, persuasion loses relevance. This is why many attempts to reframe walking away as harmful fail. Harm is measured by outcome. For many men, outcomes improved. Improved outcomes also reshape social dynamics among men themselves. Conversations become more practical and less performative. Advice is exchanged based on what works rather than what sounds good. Men share strategies for stability, efficiency, and well being. These exchanges strengthen informal networks built on mutual respect rather than competition. Competition itself takes on a different character. Instead of competing for validation or status, men compete with themselves. They track progress against their own benchmarks. This internal competition fosters growth without resentment. It replaces envy with self discipline. Self discipline becomes easier when distractions are reduced. Men who are no longer chasing approval or navigating unpredictable dynamics find it easier to maintain routines. Consistency replaces chaos. Over time, consistency produces compound benefits. Small daily actions accumulate into significant change. This compounding effect explains why the shift feels irreversible to many men. Once benefits accumulate beyond a certain point, returning to previous patterns would require giving them up. Few are willing to trade tangible gains for uncertain promises. Promises themselves are now evaluated differently. Men ask whether promises are backed by enforceable structure. Without structure, promises are treated as noise. This skepticism is not bitterness, it is calibration based on experience. Calibration changes how men interpret incentives. Incentives that once worked lose effectiveness. New incentives must align with values that have shifted toward autonomy, predictability, and fairness. Without alignment, motivation does not materialize. This alignment challenge extends beyond personal relationships into broader cultural systems. Institutions that assume automatic participation struggle when participation becomes conditional. Men who have learned to walk away apply that lesson elsewhere. They leave jobs that do not respect boundaries. They avoid commitments that lack clarity. They disengage from environments that demand loyalty without reciprocity. This broader application reinforces the mindset. Walking away is no longer a singular choice. It becomes a strategy grounded in agency rather than reaction. Once agency is reclaimed, it becomes the organizing principle of decision making. Agency also changes how men perceive responsibility. Responsibility is no longer conflated with self sacrifice. It is defined as making choices that preserve long term well being. This includes saying no when necessary. Saying no becomes an expression of responsibility rather than avoidance. Avoidance implies fear. Most men who walk away are not fearful, they are selective. They know what drains them and what sustains them. They choose accordingly. This selectivity is often mischaracterized because it challenges expectations that men should always be available, adaptable, and accommodating. As expectations clash with reality, friction increases. Some interpret this friction as social breakdown. Others see it as recalibration. Recalibration is rarely smooth. It involves tension. But tension can lead to better alignment if addressed honestly. Honesty requires acknowledging that previous arrangements were not equally beneficial. It requires examining how incentives shaped behavior. Without this examination, attempts to restore engagement will continue to fail. Men walking away have already conducted their examination. They evaluated costs and benefits. They adjusted behavior. The burden of adaptation now shifts elsewhere. This shift can feel threatening because it removes predictability. When one group changes behavior independently, others must adapt. Adaptation is uncomfortable when it requires relinquishing assumptions. But adaptation is also necessary for stability. Stability built on outdated assumptions is fragile. It collapses under pressure. Stability built on mutual benefit is resilient. Men who have created stable lives independently demonstrate this principle. Their stability does not rely on compliance from others, it relies on internal coherence. Internal coherence is difficult to disrupt. It creates a sense of self that is less dependent on external affirmation. Men with internal coherence are harder to pressure because they are less invested in approval. Approval becomes optional rather than essential. This optionality changes power dynamics. Power shifts toward those who can walk away. This is not about domination, it is about leverage. Leverage arises naturally when participation is voluntary. Voluntary participation is the foundation of healthy systems. When people choose to participate freely, commitment is genuine. When participation is coerced, resentment grows. Men walking away expose where participation was assumed rather than earned. Exposure leads to discomfort. Discomfort often triggers defensiveness. Defensiveness delays reform. Reform delayed prolongs disengagement. This cycle continues until incentives change or systems atrophy. Atrophy is not dramatic, it is gradual. It appears as reduced energy, reduced innovation, reduced contribution. By the time it is obvious, recovery is difficult. This is why early signals matter. Men walking away are an early signal. not of collapse, but of misalignment. Signals can be heeded or ignored. The choice determines the trajectory. Ignoring signals often feels easier in the short term. It avoids difficult conversations, it preserves familiar narratives, but it increases long term risk. Men already adjusted. Others must decide whether to adjust as well. Adjustment requires letting go of the idea that compliance can be restored through pressure. Pressure produces resistance or exit, and men chose exit. That choice was reinforced by improved outcomes. Improved outcomes are the strongest argument. They do not rely on rhetoric, they speak through experience. When men describe feeling calmer, healthier, and more focused, those descriptions carry weight regardless of ideology. Ideology struggles when confronted with lived reality. Men are prioritizing lived reality. That prioritization reshapes behavior more effectively than any campaign. As more men share their experiences, normalization continues. Walking away becomes a reference point rather than an anomaly. Younger men observe older ones thriving independently. This observation influences their own choices. The cycle perpetuates. This does not mean isolation becomes universal. It means participation becomes intentional. Relationships that offer balance may still form, but they form on different terms. Terms defined by mutual respect rather than obligation. Obligation without reciprocity erodes goodwill. Reciprocity without obligation builds trust. Men walking away are responding to this fundamental principle. Trust, once eroded, requires time to rebuild. Time without pressure, time with consistent behavior. Until that time passes, skepticism remains. Skepticism is not hostility, it is caution informed by experience. Men who have learned caution will not abandon it easily. As this conversation continues, it is important to avoid caricatures. Men walking away are not monolithic, they vary in background, personality, and goals. What unites them is a shared conclusion about incentives and outcomes. That shared conclusion did not arise overnight, it formed through accumulation. Accumulation of moments where effort did not lead to fairness, accumulation of experiences where trust was not rewarded, accumulation of observations where systems favored assumption over accountability. Accumulation reaches a tipping point. At that point, change accelerates. The current moment reflects such a tipping point. What comes next depends on whether incentives realign. Realignment requires courage to examine uncomfortable truths. Without courage, stagnation persists. Men have already demonstrated one form of courage by choosing an unconventional path despite criticism. That courage was rewarded with stability. Others may need to demonstrate courage by adapting. Adaptation does not mean capitulation, it means recalibration toward fairness. Fairness is not a concession, it is a foundation. Foundations matter because they determine what can be built sustainably. Men walking away are not tearing down structures, they are stepping aside from ones they no longer trust. Trust can be rebuilt, but only through consistent action. Until then, clarity remains the guiding principle. This clarity continues to spread, quietly reshaping expectations and behavior. It does not announce itself, it simply persists. And as it persists, one truth becomes increasingly difficult to deny. When people discover peace through choice, they rarely surrender it. This is not an ending, it is an inflection point. As we reach the final stretch of this conversation, it is important to step back and look at what this entire shift represents in a broader sense. This is not merely a discussion about dating or relationships, it is a discussion about autonomy, consent in the deepest sense of the word, and the right of individuals to decide where their time, energy, and resources go. Men walking away are not rejecting society. They are renegotiating their participation in it based on evidence rather than expectation. One of the most revealing aspects of this moment is how quietly it unfolded. There was no dramatic rupture, no single event that forced the change. Instead, it grew from countless small realizations. Men noticed patterns that repeated regardless of intent. They noticed that explanations did not change outcomes. They noticed that adapting further only increased demands rather than restoring balance. At a certain point, adaptation turned into erosion. Walking away became a form of self preservation. Self preservation is often misunderstood as selfishness, but that interpretation ignores context. Preserving oneself is necessary when systems fail to protect those who participate in them. Men did not abandon responsibility, they redirected it inward. They took responsibility for their mental health, their finances, their future stability, and their sense of peace. That responsibility does not vanish because it is no longer publicly visible. Visibility itself is another theme worth examining. For years, value was equated with visibility. Being seen, being chosen, being validated publicly were treated as markers of success. Men walking away reject that equation. They value privacy over performance. They value calm over applause. This shift deprives certain dynamics of the attention they relied on to function. When attention disappears, those dynamics weaken. This weakening creates discomfort for those who depended on predictable engagement. But discomfort is not injustice, it is feedback. Feedback indicates that something has changed. The appropriate response to feedback is analysis and adjustment, not denial. Men adjusted, others may need to do the same. Another critical point is that walking away does not require bitterness to sustain it. Bitterness burns energy. Most men who have disengaged are conserving energy. They do not replay arguments or relitigate past experiences endlessly. They accept what happened, extract lessons, and move forward. This forward motion is what makes the shift durable. It is not anchored to grievance, it is anchored to improvement. Improvement becomes the North Star. Men measure their lives by tangible metrics: sleep quality, stress levels, financial security, physical health, time autonomy. These metrics are difficult to argue with because they are experiential. When these indicators improve after disengagement, the conclusion reinforces itself. This reinforcement also alters how men view compromise in the future. Compromise is no longer automatic. It must be reciprocal and measurable. Men ask what is being gained and what is being risked. If the exchange does not make sense, they decline without hostility. Declining is not an attack, it is a boundary. Boundaries are central to this entire shift. For a long time, men were expected to have flexible boundaries, while others' boundaries were treated as inviolable. That imbalance eroded trust. Men who walk away reestablish boundaries clearly and enforce them consistently. Consistency reduces confusion. It also reduces conflict. When boundaries are known, fewer misunderstandings occur. Misunderstandings often arise from unspoken assumptions. Men walking away remove themselves from environments where assumptions substitute for communication. They prefer explicit agreements to implicit expectations. This preference changes the quality of interactions they are willing to entertain. Ambiguity loses appeal. As ambiguity decreases, predictability increases. Predictability is calming, it allows planning, it allows long term thinking. Men who have embraced this clarity often describe feeling more present in their own lives. They are not constantly anticipating reactions or managing perceptions. They simply act in accordance with their values. Values become clearer when external pressure is reduced. Men discover what they actually care about rather than what they were told to care about. This discovery can be surprising. Many realize they need less stimulation, less validation, and less complexity than they assumed. Simplicity becomes a feature rather than a lack. Simplicity does not mean stagnation, it means focus. Focus allows depth. Depth produces mastery. Mastery produces confidence. This progression is common among men who redirect their energy inward. They become skilled in areas that matter to them. That skill builds quiet confidence that does not depend on approval. Confidence without the need for approval is transformative. It changes how men respond to criticism. Criticism is evaluated rather than internalized. If it contains useful information, it is applied. If it does not, it is ignored. Emotional charge decreases. Objectivity increases. Objectivity also changes how men view the past. Instead of framing past experiences as personal failures, they see them as data. Data informs future decisions. This reframing reduces shame and regret. It replaces them with understanding. Understanding leads to acceptance. Acceptance allows closure. Closure frees mental space. With that space, men invest in what is in front of them rather than what is behind them. This forward orientation is one of the strongest predictors of well being. It is worth emphasizing again that none of this requires hostility toward anyone else. Men walking away are not campaigning against relationships or against women as individuals. They are disengaging from systems and dynamics that consistently produced negative outcomes for them. That distinction matters. When discussions collapse into accusations, they miss this distinction. Accusations trigger defensiveness. Defensiveness blocks learning. Learning is necessary for change. Without learning, patterns repeat. Patterns are the central theme of this entire conversation. Patterns reveal truth more reliably than isolated anecdotes. Men observe patterns across years and across different contexts. Those patterns inform their decisions. Ignoring patterns does not invalidate them. It only delays adjustment. Adjustment is inevitable when incentives change. The question is not whether adjustment will occur, but how. It can occur proactively through reform and accountability, or reactively through continued disengagement and attrition. Men have already adjusted. The remaining question is whether systems will. It is also important to acknowledge that walking away is not a universal prescription. It is a response chosen by many based on their circumstances. Others may choose different paths. What matters is that choice exists. When choice exists, participation gains legitimacy. Legitimacy arises when people feel free to say no. Only then does yes carry real meaning. Men walking away restore meaning to yes by making no available. This reframes commitment as a privilege rather than an obligation. Obligation without consent breeds resentment. Consent without pressure breeds trust. Trust is the foundation of any sustainable arrangement. Men withdrew because trust eroded. Rebuilding trust requires time, consistency, and humility. Humility is perhaps the most difficult requirement. It requires acknowledging that good intentions did not prevent harm. It requires listening to outcomes rather than defending narratives. It requires accepting that adaptation is necessary. Men have already demonstrated adaptation. They adapted by changing their behavior. They did not demand others change first. They simply adjusted their own participation. This agency is why the shift is stable. Stability built on agency is resilient. It does not depend on external validation or compliance. It persists through criticism and pressure. That resilience is why attempts to reverse the trend through messaging alone have failed. If there is a lesson here, it is that people respond to incentives and outcomes more than to words. When outcomes improve, behavior persists. When outcomes worsen, behavior changes. Men walking away experienced improved outcomes. That reality anchors the shift. As society continues to grapple with this realignment, it is crucial to avoid framing it as a moral battle. Moral framing obscures practical solutions. Practical solutions require examining risk distribution, accountability mechanisms, and reciprocity. Reciprocity does not mean equality in every action. It means fairness in structure. It means that contributions are recognized and risks are shared. Without reciprocity, participation feels extractive. Men who have walked away recognized extractive patterns and removed themselves. That action sent a signal. Whether that signal is received remains to be seen. What is clear is that the men who have stepped away are not waiting. They are living. They are building lives that feel coherent and sustainable. They are protecting their peace because they learned how difficult it was to regain. Peace, once earned, becomes non negotiable. It is not flashy. It does not trend, but it endures. Men who have found peace are unlikely to trade it for instability, regardless of pressure. This brings us to the closing thought. The conversation about men walking away is not about blame. It is about consequences. Actions produce outcomes. Systems produce incentives. People respond accordingly. If participation is desired, it must be worth participating. Worth is determined by lived experience, not rhetoric. Until lived experience changes, behavior will not. That is the reality we are in. It is not dramatic, it is not emotional, it is practical. I want to know what you think about everything we discussed today. Do you agree with what was said here? Have you seen these patterns play out in your own life or in the lives of people you know? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because this conversation is bigger than any one person. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.